A drone glides above a stretch of red earth where the desert breaks open into lines of steel, concrete, and rising foundations. What it sees is not a battlefield, not a forgotten frontier, but a construction zone that seems to stretch without end, pillars, cranes, and earth movers carving new shapes into an ancient landscape. Below, the Sahel breathes in uneven rhythms, uncertainty lingers, borders remain tense, communities still move from place to place, seeking safety as the winds of change sweep across the region. And yet, in the midst of this fragile balance, vast corridors of infrastructure appear, as if someone is preparing the ground for a future that has already been decided. Trucks roll in long columns, workers in helmets stand on scaffolding that pierces the sky, and from above it becomes clear, this is more than a project. It is an imprint, deliberate, immense, and unmistakably strategic. Here, the People's Republic of China is not merely digging soil. They are laying down the geometry of tomorrow. Hold this moment with me, because what looks quiet today may redefine tomorrow. From the ground, the Sahel feels vast. From above, it feels exposed. But from the vantage point of those who build, measure, and plan, it feels like something else entirely, a frontier waiting to be reorganized. When China first entered the Sahel nearly 2 decades ago, it did so with quiet precision. A bridge here, a power station there, projects that seemed modest, almost unassuming, pieces of a puzzle too large for most observers to see at once. But across the 2010s and early 2020s, those pieces accumulated, interlocked, and began to form the outline of a deeper strategy. By 2025, the shift was undeniable. The Belt and Road Initiative, once a broad overseas program, surged to its highest financial level in years, more than $120 billion in contracts and investments within a single half-year period. The Sahel, once considered too risky, too unpredictable, too remote, now appears on Chinese planning maps not as an afterthought but as a hinge, the place where North Africa, West Africa, and the Atlantic Corridor all meet. It is a region with needs no one debates. Electricity shortages dim the evenings in countless towns. Hospitals operate with generators that growl like old animals. Roads crumble under the weight of trucks forced to take detours hundreds of kilometers long. And in the absence of reliable infrastructure, the cost of doing business rises, the price of food rises, and the burden on the people grows heavier. Into this terrain step Chinese contractors, state-owned giants, and private conglomerates alike. Their presence is marked not by announcements, but by the hum of machinery long before dawn, by convoys carrying steel beams through dust storms, by battalions of surveyors charting ground that has never known a blueprint. They arrive in teams, engineers, geologists, electrical specialists, technicians trained to operate equipment that few local workers have handled before, and for every truck that drives across the Sahara carrying cement, another carries the complex wiring, turbines, or industrial components that make these projects function. In Niamey, substations rise beside neighborhoods newly connected to the grid. In western Mali, hospital wings take shape with materials shipped from Guangzhou. In Niger's interior, roads stretch toward mineral sites where future extraction is already being negotiated. Across the Sahelian belt, the pattern repeats, construction not as an event, but as a tide. It is this tide, steady, wide, and intentional, that distinguishes China's presence from the contracts of previous decades. These are not symbolic gestures. They are functional arteries carved into landscapes long deprived of dependable infrastructure. And yet, the foundation of this expansion rests on a simple calculation. Sahel states need what China can offer at speed and at scale. China, in turn, needs what the Sahel holds deep beneath its soil, the minerals, metals, and energy sources that power industries oceans away. But this exchange is not equal. It is negotiated, it is managed, and it is structured in ways that bind the future far more tightly than most citizens realize. In 2024 and 2025, a noticeable trend emerged. More Chinese private firms began bidding for and winning contracts in sectors beyond heavy construction. Technology hubs, commercial real estate, logistics corridors, even agricultural processing facilities. The Sahel, once a place for infrastructure alone, is becoming a testing ground for Chinese business models across multiple industries. Still, the region's volatility casts long shadows. In Niger, insurgent threats forced Chinese workers to withdraw from a major oil pipeline project, a retreat that illustrated how fragile the balance between ambition and risk can be. It was a reminder that no amount of capital, machinery, or planning can fully secure a region whose instability is rooted in deep political and historical fault lines, and this is where the Chinese model in the Sahel reveals both its resilience and its limits. Its resilience, the ability to absorb losses, renegotiate contracts, and continue building even when the environment is uncertain. Its limits, the realization that infrastructure alone cannot stabilize a terrain where governance, identity, and history remain contested. But China continues regardless, not recklessly, but deliberately, because every kilometer of road completed, every transmission line installed, every port modernized is a piece of leverage. Not leverage to dominate, but leverage to influence, to secure long-term access, long-term partnerships, and long-term relevance in a region the world once neglected but now courts once more. As these projects multiply, they create something more than utility. They create direction. Direction that favors trade routes passing through Chinese-built nodes. Direction that aligns extraction sites with external demand. Direction that shapes how the Sahel's economies will function long after the machines fall silent. A door is opening, framed in steel, lit by new power grids, paved by long corridors that did not exist a decade ago. Whether the region steps through as a partner, a supplier, or something in between, remains unwritten. But the real question is, who steps through this door next? If the Sahel's landscape appears sparse from the sky, its underground reality tells another story, one of density, pressure, and value. Beneath its cracked earth lie seams of minerals that the modern world cannot function without, and it is here, beneath this quiet surface, that the deeper logic of China's presence begins to take shape. For Beijing, resource security is not a slogan, it is an operating principle. In an era defined by renewable energy transitions, electric mobility, and digital infrastructure, the minerals powering these systems have become as strategic as oil once was. The Sahel, long marginalized in global politics, suddenly finds itself sitting on part of the new backbone of 21st century industry: uranium for nuclear grids, manganese for hardened steel and battery chemistries, gold for financial stability and industrial components, rare metals in neighboring belts, feeding technologies far from African soil. China does not chase these resources with haste, it pursues them with method. The method starts with infrastructure. A road is never simply a road. A bridge is never simply a bridge. They are arteries, routes along which minerals can move predictably, cheaply, and at scale. Without these arteries, the value trapped beneath Sahel soil remains inaccessible. With them, extraction becomes efficient, transport becomes reliable, and long-term contracts become viable. This is why Chinese-built corridors often run straight toward mining regions. It is why power stations rise near potential industrial hubs. It is why digital infrastructure accompanies physical infrastructure, ensuring that logistics, monitoring, and financial flows move in synchrony. To the untrained eye, this looks like development. To Beijing, it is the architecture of supply chain certainty. China's planners think in decades, not electoral cycles. A contract lasting 35 or 40 years is not an anomaly. It is the baseline for stability. And because these contracts often combine concessional loans, infrastructure packages, and resource offtake agreements, they create a mesh of obligations difficult for partner states to unwind. But the Sahel is not simply a resource bank. Its geography grants it a strategic position at the intersection of three major corridors: the Maghreb to the north, the Gulf of Guinea to the south, and the Red Sea Indian Ocean corridor to the east. If connectivity improves, the region becomes a land bridge. If it stagnates, it remains a buffer zone. China has no intention of letting it stagnate, at least not in areas where its interests lie. Projects in Niger, Mali, and neighboring regions illustrate this intent. Transmission lines linking extraction sites to national grids, roads designed to bypass bottlenecks created by outdated colonial infrastructure, upgraded border facilities that make cross-regional movement more predictable. Each layer supports the next. Minerals feed industry, industry feeds exports, exports feed ports, ports feed global markets, and global markets feed China's long-term strategic positioning. This is why, even when security conditions deteriorate, as seen in the 2025 withdrawal of Chinese workers from a major Nigerian oil corridor, Beijing does not abandon the vision. The withdrawal is tactical, not ideological. A pause, not a reversal. The long arc of the plan remains intact. The People's Republic of China does not merely want access to Sahel resources. It wants predictability. Predictability in volume, predictability in price, predictability in transit. A stable Sahel is good for China's supply chains. An unstable Sahel can be managed with adjusted timelines, renegotiated terms, or deeper infrastructural commitments. But a Sahel closed to Chinese access, that is unacceptable. The geopolitical dimension becomes clear here. As European influence declines and Gulf actors increase their footprint, China seeks not dominance, but anchoring. It wants to be too embedded to be excluded, too essential to be replaced, too infrastructurally intertwined to be ignored. This explains the scale. This explains the speed. This explains the willingness to build in zones where risk outweighs immediate gain. And for the Sahel, this creates a paradox. On one hand, the infrastructure offers a pathway out of isolation. More energy, more roads, more clinics, more bridges, more opportunity. On the other hand, the dependencies woven through these projects tighten with each kilometer completed. A new light shines across the Sahel. The glow of construction sites, substations, fiber lines, and machinery pushing through the twilight. Some call it development. Some call it strategy. Some call it the first glimpse of a new era. But the truth is quieter and heavier. The region is being repositioned economically, politically, geographically, and whether this repositioning becomes empowerment or constraint will depend on choices still unfolding. Yet no one knows whether this new light reveals a path or a price. In the vast geopolitical theater of the Sahel, influence does not arrive in a single form. It arrives as a spectrum, from uniforms and contractors to financiers and engineers, to emissaries bearing commercial blueprints instead of political manifestos. And in this crowded arena, three major models now shape the landscape: the Russian model of security, the Emirati model of agility, and the Chinese model of scale. Each model has its logic. Each model has its consequences, but only one of them operates with an ambition measured not in months or missions, but in decades. China's method stands apart because it does not begin with protection or persuasion. It begins with foundations poured into the ground. The Russian approach: Russia enters through the doorway of security, not always with formal troops, often through contractors whose roles blur between defense, training, and stabilization. Its presence answers an immediate need. Regimes under pressure require protection, and Moscow offers it without judgment. But this model is tied to turbulence. It strengthens governments, but rarely economies. It builds alliances, but not infrastructure. Its power lies in the moment, not in the horizon. The UAE approach. By contrast, the United Arab Emirates moves with remarkable speed. It does not wait for political consensus or multilateral green lights. Its companies build ports, free zones, airports, logistical skeletons that reshape the movement of goods and capital. And unlike Russia, the UAE pairs this with selective security support. Vehicles, training, partnerships, not ideological, not overbearing, simply efficient. But it is China that moves with depth. Where Russia offers weapons and the UAE offers corridors, China offers systems, energy, transport, digital networks, industrial capacity. It builds not just structures, but supply chains, not just facilities, but futures. This is what distinguishes Beijing's presence, the ability to bind an entire economic ecosystem around its infrastructure. A railway built by a Chinese contractor may later rely on Chinese locomotives, spare parts, financing, digital systems, and training programs. Break one link and the chain slows, sustaining the relationship for years. For governments reshaping their sovereignty, this difference matters, particularly for leaders who reject old hierarchies and search for partnerships that do not impose political conditions. Nowhere is this more evident than within the alliance of Sahel states, and especially in Burkina Faso. Under figures like Ibrahim Traoré, the region has articulated a new diplomatic philosophy, not allegiance, but alignment, not dependency, but diversification, not instructions, but negotiation on equal footing. In this context, China's model becomes appealing not because it is flawless, but because it is transactional, a form of cooperation that respects state agency even when it deepens material dependence. For Burkina Faso, this model offers a way to rebuild infrastructure after years of underinvestment. For Niger, it offers a route to monetize mineral wealth. For Mali, it provides alternatives as older partners withdraw or lose legitimacy. Each government chooses differently, but all see the advantage of having more than one powerful partner at the table. Yet distinctions between these models also raise new tensions. Russia's influence can complicate China's operational security. UAE's rapid expansion can overlap or interfere with the economic corridors Beijing seeks to anchor. And in some capitals, the presence of all three at once creates a delicate balancing act, a diplomatic choreography requiring precision and restraint. Still, the core truth remains. China is the only actor whose primary instrument is construction, whose primary language is infrastructure, and whose primary timeline is measured not in crises, but in cycles of development. This is why its presence feels different in the Sahel. It does not command attention with weapons. It does not dazzle with swift commercial deals. It works through the slow certainty of cranes, cables, and contracts. And yet, this certainty reshapes the political map as surely as any security alliance, because when you build the roads, you influence where people travel. When you build the power stations, you influence where industries grow. When you build the digital backbone, you influence how economies speak to the outside world. It is not domination, it is architecture, and architecture carries power. The Sahel's future will not be determined by any single model, Russian, Emirati, or Chinese. It will emerge from the interplay of these forces and from how Sahelian leaders navigate them to preserve sovereignty while pursuing development. But as the region rewires its alliances, one truth becomes clear. The old borders drawn by colonial pens no longer define the strategic landscape. A new set of boundaries, economic, infrastructural, ideological, is forming in their place. Whether these boundaries liberate the region or restrict it depends on decisions still unfolding. And perhaps the lines we see are not borders, but boundaries waiting to be rewritten. For many in the Sahel, the arrival of Chinese machinery feels like the arrival of possibility. Roads that once disappeared in the rainy season now hold firm. Bridges once made of timber now stand in concrete. Villages that flickered with generator lights now connect to national grids powered by new substations. To communities long accustomed to absence, this presence feels transformative. But transformation is never simple. The first layer is opportunity, clear and immediate, infrastructure delivered at a pace unmatched by traditional partners, hospitals equipped faster than procurement cycles used to allow, energy projects capable of altering entire economic landscapes, and logistics corridors that shorten journeys once measured not in hours but in days. For local officials, these gains matter. A reliable road means lower food prices. A functioning clinic means lives saved. A stable electricity grid means shops can stay open, small industries can grow, and students can study beyond sunset. But beneath that layer lies a second truth, thinner and more fragile. Debt accumulates quietly. Maintenance requires technology and spare parts that often come from abroad. Contracts written in technical language obscure obligations that communities discover only when budgets tighten. And for every infrastructure ribbon cut, questions linger about ownership, sustainability, and control. Some residents notice that machinery parks in guarded compounds, that environmental assessments appear after, not before, extraction begins. That local jobs are temporary, while mineral offtake agreements stretch for decades. To them, the trade-off feels uneven, progress visible above ground, vulnerability buried below it. The tension deepens when security falters. At times, construction sites fall silent, not because funding stops, but because conflict approaches. Workers evacuate, timelines stretch, and rising instability becomes the enemy of both ambition and continuity. Yet, even in moments of uncertainty, the Sahel does not reject China. It evaluates, it recalibrates, it weighs the cost of dependence against the cost of stagnation, because for many leaders, the alternative is not a better offer from elsewhere. The alternative is nothing at all. Communities along new routes understand this balance instinctively. They stand between gratitude and caution. They welcome the bridges, but worry about what crosses them. They value the roads, but question where they ultimately lead. They appreciate the electricity, but wonder who controls the switch. These questions do not diminish the progress made, they sharpen it. They force Sahelian governments to ask not only what they build, but for whom and at what lasting cost. And so the region watches the cranes and cables with a mixture of hope and hesitation, knowing that every project carries both promise and price. Every new corridor, a potential pathway, and a potential compromise. The Sahel stands in the light of these new constructions, but light alone does not reveal the full truth. Still, one question hangs in the air, unanswered. Across the vast sweep of the Sahel, a new pattern is forming, not in speeches or treaties, but in the quiet geometry of roads, energy lines, and mineral corridors. Piece by piece, a connective tissue is emerging, one that stretches beyond national borders and into the deeper architecture of global supply chains. For decades, the region functioned as a buffer, a strip of land separating North Africa from the tropical belt, a frontier where crises traveled faster than commerce, a space others described but rarely invested in at scale. Today, that narrative is changing. Chinese-built corridors now link interior cities to coastal economies. Energy grids plug once isolated communities into wider networks. Projects once dismissed as too ambitious, cross-border rail, regional power pools, mineral-to-port highways, now sit on planning tables with detailed engineering schedules and financing structures. This shift does not occur in a vacuum. It alters the balance of influence across Africa and beyond. Europe, long accustomed to shaping regional policy, now finds its leverage diluted. Infrastructure gaps it struggled to address for decades are being filled by others, quickly, visibly, and at times decisively. The Sahel's economic gravitational pull is tilting eastward, not only toward Beijing, but toward the constellation of actors aligned with its supply chain logic. The Gulf states, meanwhile, see advantage in complementarity rather than competition. If China lays the longitudinal routes, the UAE builds the nodes, ports, free zones, trade hubs. Together, intentionally or not, they rewire commercial flows that once passed through European-controlled systems. Russia, too, remains in the equation. Where China builds and the Gulf negotiates, Moscow supplies security partnerships. These three forces do not form an alliance, they form a mosaic, a multipolar ecosystem in which the Sahel becomes the terrain of experimentation. But the most transformative shift is internal. As the region weaves new ties outward, it also weaves new ties inward. The creation of the Alliance of Sahel states redefines regional diplomacy. States that once negotiated separately now coordinate strategically, using external interest as leverage to reshape their collective bargaining power. For the first time in generations, the Sahel is not merely reacting to global politics, it is influencing them. Yet influence comes with complexity. Cross-border connectivity can foster unity, but it can also expose disparities. Resource corridors can enrich national budgets, but they can deepen local grievances if benefits do not reach communities. The arrival of new partners can create diplomatic flexibility, but it can fragment regional priorities if strategies diverge. These tensions do not negate the promise, they sharpen the need for clarity, because the Sahel stands at a genuine pivot, one that determines whether the region becomes a corridor of extraction or a corridor of transformation. The Belt and Road may open doors, but it does not choose who walks through them. The Gulf may build ports, but it does not decide what sails from them. Russia may offer protection, but it does not define what is being protected. Only the Sahel can do that, and the choices made now, in contracts, in regulations, in regional coordination, will define whether this moment becomes the start of a sovereign renaissance or another chapter written by others. The horizon is shifting, the pathways are forming, the pivot is unmistakable, because the pivot is here, but the direction remains uncertain. The Sahel stands at a strange, delicate threshold, a place where history meets possibility, where old patterns still echo but no longer determine the rhythm of tomorrow. For generations, the region was spoken about rather than spoken with, defined by external narratives that carved its identity into crises, fragility, and need. This legacy still lingers. It weighs heavily. It reminds the Sahel of all the years when its future was treated as someone else's decision, but something has shifted. Little by little, choice is returning. New partners have arrived. China with its vast infrastructure, the Gulf with its logistical ambition, Russia with its security networks, and each brings opportunity as well as risk. Yet the presence of many partners changes the dynamic itself. It breaks the old dependency on single pathways. It gives the region room to negotiate, room to question, room to restructure its alliances on its own terms. Across Burkina Faso, across Mali, across Niger, the desire for self-definition has grown louder than the fear of external pressure. Citizens speak differently, governments negotiate differently, and leaders such as Ibrahim Traoré articulate a direction in which sovereignty is not a distant aspiration, but a daily practice, a discipline of choosing partners without surrendering purpose. In his speeches, Ibrahim Traoré often frames the region's struggle not as an escape from the past, but as a re-entry into agency, a refusal to let history dictate the future, a belief that even in a land marked by scarcity, dignity can become the foundation for development, unity, and long-term stability. This is the true heart of the Sahel's transformation, not the roads, not the power stations, not the mineral corridors, but the awakening of a political will that demands to shape the meaning of those things. The question is no longer whether outside powers will build infrastructure. The question is whether the Sahel will shape the purpose of that infrastructure, whether these new connections will extract value or generate it, whether they will narrow futures or expand them. The answer is still unfolding. It lies in the negotiations ahead, the policies yet to be drafted, the regional unity still forming. But one truth stands clear. The region is no longer waiting for permission to define itself. Hold this horizon. What rises in the Sahel may light paths far beyond it.